How are Rousseau's views in the Second Discourse a reflection of prior philosophy, and how did they compare to contemporary thinkers? Although his philosophy as a whole was quite original, Rousseau was heavily influenced by the prior philosophies of both Hobbes and Locke. Their philosophies shaped his views on inequality and property, and Rousseau's application of those views to the Age of Enlightenment greatly contrasted with contemporary thinkers. Rousseau published his Discourse on Inequality in 1754, during the height of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement which took place throughout 18th century Europe and surrounded the importance of and the effects of reason. The movement brought with it a new, explicitly modern understanding of human beings' place in the world. And with this understanding came questioning from philosophers about how human beings had arrived at this specific state and whether or not this state was desirable. Prior to the Enlightenment, the most prominent theories on this were conceived by Thomas Hobbes in his essay, Leviathan. In some way or another, Hobbes' Leviathan influenced all Enlightenment thinkers. Along with Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot, and more adopted Hobbes' conception of civil society as a sort of social contract centered around the transfer of rights. These thinkers all agreed that society was a result of man giving up his rights in exchange for protection from the sovereign and unity in the state. Men entering into this contract was how humans had arrived at their current state. Rousseau differed from most thinkers in that he did not consider this transfer between subject and sovereign or the establishment of political societies to be a natural course of action for man. Instead of civil society stemming from the natural socialization of men, like some philosophers believed, Rousseau believed that man consults his reason and then chooses to enter into civil society, despite his loss of natural freedom, because in exchange, he's granted civil freedom and the right to property that is protected by the state. Rousseau saw the conscious entry of man into society as a deviation from man's natural state. In Leviathan, Hobbes describes what he conceives of as the state of nature. His natural man is violent and chaotic and in a constant state of war. Rousseau had an entirely different conception. He saw the natural state of man as one of freedom and equality. But once man enters into the social contract, he loses that freedom. This sentiment is emphasized in Rousseau's famous quote from The Social Contract: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." While Hobbes saw war-ridden man as man in its natural state, Rousseau interpreted it as a product of society and considered it an ever-increasing deviation from man's primitive natural state. Despite this fundamental difference in their views of nature, Rousseau and Hobbes came to similar conclusions about how inequality arises from man and civil society, showing us that Rousseau adopted more than just the idea of the social contract from Hobbes. He may have also derived his ideas of inequality from Hobbes. Rousseau saw the right of property as the cause of competition and rivalry, conflicts of interest, and the desire to profit at another's expense. Hobbes shared a similar sentiment in relating wealth to power and claiming that if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies and endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. While Rousseau blamed the state and its civil rights for this conflict, Hobbes's natural man and his right to pursue desires was to blame. But while their origins may be different, Hobbes and Rousseau seem to agree that property, or the desire of the same thing, leads to men destroying one another. Another likely inspiration for Rousseau was John Locke. In the Second Discourse, Rousseau cites Locke in saying, "Where there is no property, there can be no injury." Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau all believed that owning property could lead to inequalities and fighting over property could lead to war. However, this opinion was not popular among Rousseau's contemporaries. The Enlightenment was a time of radical improvement in the human condition. This radical improvement involved a scientific revolution and the introduction of commercialized lifestyles. The Enlightenment was the era in which public finance was established and states began competing in economic rivalry. Although Rousseau acknowledged these progressions as the reasoning behind human socialization and the establishment of the current state as he knew it, he also confronted it as a catalyst in the downfall of man. The rights that other philosophers argued bettered the human condition, like protection, unity, and property, were the very things that Rousseau claimed were worsening it, due to man's superficial conformity and competitive drive. While these civil rights grant men entry into an entirely new sphere of intellect and existence, as seen with the scientific revolution during the Enlightenment, their presence was inspiring the want of man to differentiate themselves from one another. Rousseau claimed that as long as the availability of these rights existed, people would want more than they need, get more than they need, and the distributions of rights would become unequal. However, for most Enlightenment philosophers, access to civil rights such as property were seen as the pinnacle of the human condition. Rousseau's contemporary, Bernard Mandeville, claimed that luxury consumption created employment, encouraged commerce, and promoted diversity, and that the benefits it created far outweighed the moral costs. Another contemporary, Voltaire, was a vigorous defender of the pursuit of pleasure and celebrated hedonistic living in his Essai sur l'humour. Voltaire saw material acquisition and commerce as an advancement of civilization, not a regression. In this way, you can see how Rousseau differed greatly from his contemporaries. Rousseau advocated for the restraint of wealth, arts, property, luxury, or anything else that could fuel a nature of hubris and would lead to inequality, and for that he was criticized. One can clearly see that Rousseau was inspired by elements of both Hobbes and Locke, adopting Hobbes's social contract, yet differing in how he saw men entering that contract, and then adopting and adapting both Hobbes's and Locke's views on property and how property could lead to inequality, war, and destruction. In the second discourse, Rousseau walks through the history of man and reaches conclusions about society and its provisions, specifically its protection of property. What we are left with is a view that was greatly criticized by Rousseau's Enlightenment contemporaries, but which makes sense when one considers the philosophers whom Rousseau had read and was familiar with, like Hobbes and Locke, and the Enlightenment world of property and consumption that Rousseau was living in. In many ways, Rousseau's views are a reflection of prior philosophy, being applied in an urgent way due to his surroundings. At the same time, he was contrasting heavily with the views of other Enlightenment thinkers, resulting in his work being met with criticism.